Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
And now, the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to the Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Thursday, April 9th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of the Federal Drive, GSA spent more than $100 million on building studies, but an Inspector General audit found the agency lacked a consistent way to track whether that work actually informed decisions. Plus, HUD's first-year reset on fair housing guidance is reshaping how landlords, owners, and local governments navigate federal housing rules. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of the Federal Drive. We begin with this. The federal government currently has both the largest political workforce and the lowest levels of senior career leaders in decades. A new report finds that there are now more political appointees in place under the Trump administration than under any other modern U.S. president. At the same time, senior career leadership staffing has gone down 30%. Here with more details is Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. Drew, thanks for joining me.
Nice to be with you today, Terry.
These stats come from a new report from the Partnership for Public Service. Tell us more about what they found.
This trend is something that we've started to see under the Trump administration. The report found that non-confirmed, so non-Senate confirmed political appointees in the federal workforce are at their highest levels in 40 years. By the end of 2025, President Trump had more than 1,800 political appointees in the Schedule C classification. That's a category of political appointees that don't require Senate confirmation. But those more than 1,800 political appointees in Schedule C is the peak level that we've seen under the current Trump administration, and also higher than any that has occurred from any other modern president. At the same time, the number of career members in the senior executive service has declined, as you said, by 30%. That was a finding from the report. That's due to a combination of retirements, resignations, and some terminations of SES members, as the Trump administration has pursued significant cuts to the federal workforce. As a result of that, we've seen the number of career SES members drop from about 8,100 at the end of the Biden administration to now about 5,800 as of January 2026. So that's several thousand who have been lost or left their jobs, and it's a record low since at least 1998.
What does the partnership say is the effect of that swap, that trend?
What they point out in their report is that both roles, the political appointees in Schedule C as well as career senior leaders, are both important to managing the federal government. They say political appointees set policy direction, while career officials have more of the management background and expertise within government to make sure that agencies can run effectively. But if you have, as the partnership says, a surge in political appointees and a drop in career leadership, that can lead to a loss of institutional knowledge that career leaders would have had between administrations. It could also lead to a decline in the quality of federal services, and what the partnership says would be likely increasing political control at agencies. So the partnership ultimately says, it's not that political appointees are necessarily unqualified, and many do bring value to agencies. But if you have agencies that are led by officials who are selected for, quote, political loyalty rather than their competence or qualifications, that can lead to a decline ultimately in expertise.
Does the partnership offer a prediction about how this trend will play out over time?
It's likely, at least for the next couple of years under the Trump administration, for this to continue. There have been a couple changes from the administration recently that are likely going to lead to even more political appointees, or positions akin to political appointees, according to the partnership. So for one, in July 2025, President Trump signs an executive order creating Schedule G in the federal workforce. And this is a new employment classification that's quite similar to Schedule C, but essentially allows the president to make more political appointments beyond what we see in Schedule C. There's also expected to soon be the finalization of Schedule Policy/Career in the federal workforce. And while that is still technically going to be a career section of federal employees, the partnership argues that because those positions would be more easily fireable and replaced with people who would be more willing to carry out the president's priorities and policy agenda, that likely means that there could be at least something that looks similar to political appointees, even if the official title is not political.
So what else has changed for the SES under the Trump administration?
There have been a lot of changes. One of the biggest ones is that the Office of Personnel Management under the Trump administration has capped the number of career SES members who can receive high ratings on their performance reviews. This is something where we're going to soon see this replicated for the entire federal workforce. But the final rule that creates required limitations on those high levels of performance that's already in place for the career SES and those high levels of federal positions. Other than that, there have also been changes to the elements contained inside of SES performance reviews, where OPM has now made whether you are adhering to the president's priorities what they're calling, quote, the most critical element of SES reviews, so making that the top priority there. And also, even after this 30% decline in SES staffing, a couple months ago, OPM advised agencies to consider further reducing their SES staffing in response to the broader federal workforce cuts that we've seen. Long story short, there's a lot going on for the SES here.
Does the partnership's report make any recommendations for addressing what it's now articulating as sort of an imbalance between senior political and senior career officials?
One issue that they are recommending Congress tackle is to establish a cap on Schedule C appointments, while at the same time blocking any presidential administration from creating a new category of political appointees, unless, of course, Congress approves something. This is because what we've seen in the current workforce is that because of the SES reductions on the career side, political SES members now make up 11% of the SES, and that is above the statutory limit. So what the partnership is saying is essentially a way to kind of stop that or reverse that trend is by making sure that the president can't kind of circumvent that option for political appointees. And then more generally, the partnership recommended that there's just more transparency in who is in political positions across government. This is something where we do have some of that information under what's called the Plum Book from OPM, but that's required only to be updated annually, and it's also been shown to have some gaps or errors in the data recently. So the partnership is saying that it needs to essentially be filled out more completely and perhaps be updated on a quarterly basis rather than just annually.
That's Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. Drew, thanks for bringing us this story.
Thank you.
You can find the full details at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, GSA spent more than $100 million on building studies. But an inspector general audit found the agency lacked a consistent way to track whether that work actually informed decisions. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Over a 5-year period, GSA's Public Building Service obligated more than $100 million for building studies. But a new Inspector General audit finds the agency lacked a consistent way to track those studies or whether their recommendations actually informed decisions. We'll break down what the audit examined, what it found, and what GSA has been asked to fix with Michelle Westrup and Brian Gibson from the GSA Office of the Inspector General. Ms. Westrup and Mr. Gibson, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having us.
Ms. Westrup, I'd like to start with you. You just did an audit on GSA's public building services and how they manage the building studies that they commission across the federal real property portfolio. Before we dig into your findings, can you first tell us what these building studies are and what they're supposed to do?
Sure, absolutely. So PBS, or GSA's Public Building Service, hires consultants to conduct building studies to determine the condition of buildings, evaluate options for possible building improvements, and provide information for specific project guidance. Building studies fill a critical need for PBS's management and oversight of its real property portfolio. PBS, once these studies take place, PBS then uses these studies to inform management decisions about all types of things: acquiring, renovating, operating, and maintaining all of the buildings in their portfolio.
You looked at a 5-year period, 2019 to 2024, and over that time frame, PBS spent more than $133 million for these building studies. As you looked into it, what did you find about how consistently those studies were tracked and monitored?
Sure. We found that PBS wasn't comprehensively tracking or monitoring these building studies. One of the first steps we took in the audit was to request even just a list of all the studies that were performed at GSA-owned buildings during that 5-year audit period. And PBS management could not provide us with a reliable list. The Office of Portfolio Management, which is one of PBS's branches, provided us with a list that they compiled, but they had to pull that list from multiple data sources. Even with them doing that, we could not verify the reliability of that list. When we analyzed that list that they provided, a lack of naming conventions kept us from verifying its reliability. We also found that the data potentially included duplicate information and was also incomplete at the same time. So, for instance, we were able to find some studies that were performed at GSA buildings and included in a PBS system that we found, but they were not included on the list that was provided to us by PBS management. So we concluded that improvements could and should be made to assist PBS in better managing its real estate portfolio.
That seems like just the tip of the iceberg there. Mr. Gibson, let me go to you. You found that PBS lacked complete and reliable data, not just on the studies that were conducted, as Ms. Westrup said, but also on whether recommendations were acted on. So what does that gap mean for decision-making inside the Public Building Service?
Sure. Well, quality information is critical for decision-making. It's not just a principle of internal control that we auditors like to expand on, but it's common sense. You make better decisions when you have better information. So without complete, accurate, and reliable information on its studies, PBS may not be able to make the best decisions on its programs and assets, and this could prevent PBS from effectively and efficiently carrying out its mission and ultimately place taxpayer dollars at risk. So, for example, for portfolio management, this could hamper decisions related to the strategic direction for PBS's assets and lead to inadequate policies on the rent PBS charges to its tenant agencies. For facilities management, the other component we discuss in the report, it could undermine their ability to meet their mission of delivering safe, reliable, and productive workplaces at the best value for the taxpayer.
You spoke in some generalities there, but I want to ask you something specific. The Public Building Service has made no secret of its intent to sell or offload a number of government-owned buildings. How is it or is it not using these building studies and the data that they would provide to value that portfolio and decide which ones are the most beneficial to sell, and at what price?
Sure. Well, these building studies are used, they're a critical component of the deferred maintenance, that figure that PBS reports on an annual basis. And so if you don't have accurate and reliable information on these studies, you might be missing some of those deferred maintenance costs that would be factored into decisions on disposing of assets. It's no secret that they have a significant deferred maintenance backlog, but, is it the right number? Do they know exactly what building has what deferred maintenance liability so they can target that building appropriately for disposal?
I'm speaking with Michelle Westrup. She's the Regional Inspector General for Auditing, and Brian Gibson is the Deputy Assistant Inspector General for Real Property Audits. Both are from the GSA Office of the Inspector General. Ms. Westrup, let's come back to you. The report points out that building studies are federal records, subject to the Federal Records Act and GSA retention policies. How well was PBS positioned to locate and preserve these records when your team requested them?
As referred to earlier, they were not well positioned really at all. They really hadn't set themselves up for success in this area. The Office of Portfolio Management does have a policy that requires its staff to upload completed building studies into a system that they have called the Building Assessment Tool, or BAT. However, during our audit, we tested that and found that not all building studies were even uploaded into that system. To get down into the nitty-gritty, we selected a sample of 158 building studies across 48 different buildings to see if they were uploaded into this system. And we found that PBS only uploaded 31 or 20% of those 158 building studies of our sample. And then the flip side of that, the other portfolio that Brian referred to earlier, PBS's Office of Facilities Management, they were unable to provide us even a listing of studies that we could rely upon for any further testing. They couldn't provide us with any guidance on how they use the building studies or requirements such as this system for tracking and monitoring them. So they really had a lot of room for improvement.
So is that a process problem? Do they just not have the processes and oversight in place? Is it a systems problem? The system doesn't do a good job tracking all of this, or is it some combination of all of that?
I would say it's more of a process, policy, and oversight. Process meaning they need the processes in place to track and monitor them. And then they need policies to require that the employees and the staff fulfill whatever those requirements are to track them, to put them into a system. And then that third piece is the oversight. Then some manager, some supervisor, some oversight entity needs to come in and ensure that that's being done consistently.
Mr. Gibson, let me come back to you. PBS is in the middle of a broader reorganization. They're centralizing their structure. They have lost staff as a result of some of the reorganizations over the past year. How does this shortcoming in the tracking and data that you all identified make that transition more complicated?
Sure. Well, the issues certainly make it harder for PBS to have a comprehensive picture of the needs and problems facing its portfolio. But we kind of see this as an opportunity for PBS. One of the things we note in the report is that under its new centralized structure, PBS will need complete, accurate, and reliable information about all aspects of its operations, including building studies, to effectively and efficiently allocate resources to its nationwide portfolio of buildings. These resources obviously include staffing. With fewer personnel and a centralized structure, PBS needs good information to assign the staff to priority areas. And if managed properly, building studies can be an excellent source of this information. So we think if PBS improves its means of tracking and monitoring these studies, it can more efficiently leverage the valuable information the studies provide to address problems, improve operations, and drive decisions about its portfolio.
One of the management topics in this space that you mentioned a little bit earlier was the maintenance backlog. In recent congressional testimony, there was a range given to that between $25 and $50 billion. There's a lot of zeros there. But if we can't decide whether it's 25 or 50 billion, how could PBS possibly prioritize that work?
Sure. Well, whether it's 26 billion or 50 billion, it's a big number, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done in that space. But certainly looking at the building studies, capturing the results of those studies, assessing them, and being able to track what those studies say can really help inform PBS decisions, as I mentioned earlier. Again, they use these studies to come up with this deferred maintenance figure. It can help them have more accurate and reliable information on the buildings that they're looking to dispose and really drive decisions about which ones they should prioritize.
So, Ms. Westrup, let me come back to you then. The report makes some very specific recommendations. Walk us through those and maybe where you're seeing progress.
Sure. So our first recommendation, this kind of goes back to what we were talking to earlier, is the process recommendation, right? So it's for PBS to develop and implement a method to track and monitor building studies. One, just a method to track them, and then ensure that they can retrieve them efficiently, effectively, quickly, if they need to make quick on-the-fly decisions, calculated decisions, whatever management decisions they need to make. So that's our process recommendation is the first one. And then the second recommendation really goes more to policy, is to develop and implement policies to ensure that the study data is accurate, complete, reliable. Second, of course, in the heart of everything that we do, to ensure that we're not wasting taxpayer dollars on unnecessary studies, duplicative studies, studies that have been done and just not acted upon, that type of thing. And then third goes back to what you referred to earlier, and ensuring that the building studies are preserved in accordance with the Federal Records Act. Once those recommendations and actions are complete, then that's where the oversight would come in for PBS to ensure that it's being done on a consistent basis. And as far as where PBS is on those recommendations, they have a corrective action plan due in response to this audit and our recommendations due in early May, I believe May 5th. And so we'll learn more about their proposed actions at that time.
I've been speaking with Michelle Westrup. She's the Regional Inspector General for Auditing, and Brian Gibson, who is the Deputy Assistant General for Real Property Audits. Both are from the GSA Office of the Inspector General. Thank you both so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, small businesses are navigating one of the most turbulent federal contracting environments in decades, and the SBA Office of Advocacy is here to help. But first, HUD's first-year reset on fair housing guidance is reshaping how landlords, owners, and local governments navigate federal housing rules. You're listening to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. HUD's decision to withdraw long-standing fair housing guidance is changing how landlords, developers, and local governments interpret their federal obligations, even as the underlying law remains the same. The move is raising new questions about compliance, enforcement, and how much certainty housing providers can rely on as policy priorities shift. Helping us make sense of that landscape is Gwen Roy Harrison, a principal at Offutt Kerman. Gwen, thanks for joining me today.
Good morning. Great to be here with you.
You have just done a review of the Housing and Urban Development Administration after 1 year of the second Trump administration, and you found something really interesting, I think, that HUD withdrew a wide swath of long-standing fair housing guidance in its first year. As you dug in, what did you identify as perhaps motivations for this approach?
So I think some of HUD's motivation is spelled out in their withdrawal memos. They cite that these documents were sub-regulatory guidance, not binding law, and they were intended to provide a roadmap for stakeholders, but not to be the controlling authority. So this, I think, highlights an overarching theme of this administration, a move towards deregulation, signals that HUD intends to only issue guidance where it's necessary and where it reduces compliance burdens, but not where it increases compliance burdens. So the takeaway here is that HUD is moving away from being a how-to manual for housing providers and focusing its agency on a more narrow approach.
That really is a shift in perspective and approach. I mean, some of this guidance had been in use for more than a decade and covered a lot of very important criteria that housing managers and community managers needed to know. How does that removal then of this compliance guidance shape day-to-day decisions for landlords and managers?
So some of this guidance had been in effect for 2 decades in some cases, and it really became the how-to manual for residential property management. I would say the biggest day-to-day shift for housing providers is that the fair housing obligations don't disappear. The Fair Housing Act is still in effect. That hasn't gone away. Nothing has changed there. But it's really the operation manual that HUD had put out there that has changed in terms of housing providers not being able to rely on that any longer. As an example, fair housing allegations or discrimination claims are really fact specific. So who said what, when was the request made, who responded, was any kind of final determination issued? And without HUD's playbook, it makes it more difficult for housing providers to know what the guardrails are and what they should do in terms of having a step-by-step standard operating procedure in their offices. In turn, without HUD's playbook, now housing providers are going to have to rely on state and local jurisdictions. Certain states or even some localities or cities may have more or less restrictive fair housing laws. They could have more aggressive enforcement, or they could have more or less resources applied towards those investigations. So I think it's going to become really specific to the individual jurisdiction that you're operating out of. And I think we're going to see a lot of variability across the jurisdictions because it's going to be left to the courts, and some courts may not agree in terms of their interpretation.
You highlighted that some of this guidance had been in effect for over 2 decades. That crosses multiple presidential administrations. So now, without that prior guidance, how much uncertainty does this create for the providers and the enforcers in the courts? You mentioned that there will be variability across jurisdictions.
I think the takeaway for housing providers is to stay the course. Although HUD has removed its guidance documents, that doesn't change what the law is. It just changes who housing providers are turning to as the referee. So housing providers felt confident and secure in the fact that they could rely on HUD's playbook. And now without that playbook, it's going to be tested by the court system. And that creates risk. So the rules haven't changed. It's just the referee who has changed. And a lot of these fair housing disputes ultimately don't end up going to trial. A lot of them resolve early. So there isn't a whole lot of definitive case law in terms of fact-specific scenarios. Obviously, overarching big determination, there is case law on, what would be permissible or not. But once we get into the nitty-gritty of, well, what about this nuance or what about that? I think it's going to take a while for the framework to start to develop and for case law, because that doesn't happen immediately. HUD makes an announcement, they have a rule. It may be a month or a couple months, and then we know what the framework is. But with the court system, it could be years before we know what the framework is.
I'm speaking with Gwen Roy Harrison. She's a principal at Offutt Kerman. That does sound like a risky proposition then for landlords and community managers. What sort of a risk-based approach should they be taking now that this playbook isn't the referee, as you name it?
So in terms of housing providers' response, ideally they already have standard operating procedures that they've developed over the years from 2007 through 2024, when different guidance documents have come out. And by that, I mean criminal screening, tenant application procedures, and they should stick with what they have in place. Just because there's been a change or a directional shift with this administration, that doesn't indicate that the law has changed, and administrations change. So in a few years, there could be a 180-degree shift back to where things were before. 2 other things I think are important to point out is that we've had changes in the administration, the presidential administration, over the past couple cycles that have gone from blue to red, back and forth. And so you see some of that with the changes to HUD. So it wouldn't surprise me if things take a different turn in the next couple years. The other point I wanted to make is that in the housing space, a lot of this is the result of the COVID-19 pandemic. When 2020 hit and there was eviction moratoria, there was freeze on development, there was reductions in cash flow and investment, we're still seeing the ripple effect repercussions of those now. And I think some of this HUD guidance is in direct response to that in terms of trying to make housing more affordable and easier access, and deregulating housing providers in terms of the restrictions that were previously placed.
That affordability question is coming up a lot these days. In fact, we're seeing some legislative movement on efforts to make housing more affordable. But HUD is highlighting that mortgage burdens are lower, rents are declining, that there's more home buyer support. How do those priorities interact with the agency's apparent pullback on some of the civil rights guidance and administrative oversight?
Seems like HUD is presenting a consistent narrative across its program and across its enforcement messaging, that it can reach affordability through deregulation and through closing administrative burdens. So part of the pullback on the civil rights aspect is reducing the burdens. Also, HUD had pretty significant staffing cuts to the Fair Housing Office that enforces and investigates fair housing claims. And it seems as if they're prioritizing affordability and investing their time, money, and energy in other aspects of HUD's programs rather than in the civil rights aspect.
You mentioned that you've seen the administrative approach kind of switch back and forth across the parties as the presidential administrations change. Are there significant differences now in how HUD under the Trump administration is approaching its administrative responsibilities compared to where it was under President Biden?
So one, I think, enlightening point here is that HUD Secretary Scott Turner made an announcement last year that said that DEI is dead at HUD and any program that doesn't comply with executive orders will not receive funding. And we've seen a whole swath of executive orders and a whole lot of announcements from HUD. Even in the month of February, which is the shortest month, there was 8 announcements from HUD. So that's 2 a week. And that signaling to me is clear in terms of what their priorities are going to be over the next couple years and where they're going to focus their funding. Which is away from providing interpretive guidance and a move towards deregulation and allowing the courts to make the ultimate decision in these cases for housing providers.
As you think about the trends of 2025 and look ahead to 2026, what should housing providers and developers and even local governments be prepared for? Do you expect more withdrawal of regulations, or are they going to settle into sort of a new normal stasis?
With HUD, I think change is the name of the game. I think housing providers should be prepared for continued change. HUD has explicitly said that its withdrawal list is not necessarily final, that the agency may revise or reissue guidance if it decides that it's necessary or reduce burdens. There's a big emphasis on identifying fraud, waste, and abuse, especially when it comes to federal funds spent on affordable housing. So I would expect more announcements in that regard. HUD has recently announced indications or moves towards citizenship verification for residents living in affordable housing, work requirements for residents living in public housing accommodations, proof of citizenship there as well, and then removal of funding for housing authorities that don't comply with HUD's criteria for entrance or eligibility into those programs. So all in all, I would say HUD's withdrawal of these fair housing guidance changes the map, but it doesn't change the terrain that we're on. So the Fair Housing Act still governs. HUD has historically, over the past 10 to 20 years, been kind of the trail guide for housing providers to follow. And without that guide, housing providers are now left to navigate the terrain on their own. We know what safeguard rails are, continuing to follow the same guidance. But for housing providers who seek to step outside of that, I think they're going to face risk in the court system and yet to be seen. More change to come, I suspect.
I've been speaking with Gwen Roy Harrison. She's a principal at Offutt Kerman. Really appreciate you joining me today. Thanks for this explanation.
Thanks so much for having me. Take care.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up next, small businesses are navigating one of the most turbulent federal contracting environments in decades, and the SBA Office of Advocacy is here to help. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. The SBA Office of Advocacy has released its first-year report, examining how small businesses are responding to rapid shifts in federal contracting and regulatory policy. The findings highlight both strain and adaptation as firms adjust to changing rules and agency priorities. We'll walk through what stood out and what comes next with Chip Bishop, Deputy Chief Counsel for Advocacy at the Small Business Administration. Mr. Bishop, thanks so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. It's really great to be here.
We're going to get into the details of your annual report here, but before we do, I'd like to have you tell me what the Office of Advocacy at the Small Business Administration actually does.
I would be delighted. I've been a federal regulator for over a decade, and I'm still learning what our office does because there's a lot of people that just don't know what we are. So the Office of Advocacy at the Small Business Administration was set up by Congress in 1976. So we're rounding the bend on our 50th year right now. And we were set up to be a liaison between the small entities, which includes small businesses, nonprofits, and also municipalities with under 50,000, and be the liaison between them and all the federal agencies. So that's a little unique. We're one of the only federal agencies that spans the entire government to work on regulatory issues.
We're hearing that 2025 was a tough year for small businesses between the Small Business Administration's audit of the 8A program, new changes to DEI regulations, just outright terminations of various different programs. At the Office of Advocacy, what are you hearing from this constituency?
Yeah, we're hearing a lot of voices. That's one of the key inputs that we have in our office is that we get out into the field. We hear from people all across the country. And we hear a lot. You're right. There's a lot of changes to the small business community, but there's also a lot of excitement. I'd say that the undercurrent of opportunity is strong. So I often hear them say, I'm not sure about getting this loan, or this regulation, is it hurting me? But I'm excited for where we're going. Can we please work together and iron things out so we can just keep trucking, keep building prosperity, creating jobs, putting food on our plates?
Are there federal agencies where the relationship to this community is stronger than others?
Yeah, I think that there's a number of federal agencies that have more of a regional presence. I'm thinking about housing and urban development. I know EPA has regional offices. HHS does as well. So those who are out in the field have that huge benefit of tapping into real businesses where they live and work.
And the flip side then is, are there some agencies that are just harder to get along with for the small business, small entity community?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think that there's this kind of perennial issue that the authority to regulate and government power is concentrated in Washington, D.C., but the real information that drives the economy forward and drives the whole country is out in the field. So agencies that just operate from D.C. without considering where the small businesses are and what issues they face, I think that they're a little bit in the dark. So I really urge every agency to get out in the field and hear the voices that we're hearing every day.
Well, let's get into the report that talks about what you're hearing and how agencies are responding. You just released your first year report, and it tracks regulatory costs and paperwork burdens. That's another topic that's gotten a lot of headlines. The Trump administration is really on a deregulatory tack. So what are you hearing? What are agencies driving, and what's the impact on small business?
Yeah, Terry, I'll tell you, this is one of the most exciting parts of the job because we get to interface with the small businesses who are voicing, hey, we're trying to fill gaps here and we're trying to be on the cutting edge of innovation, but the regulations are kind of boxing us out. Meanwhile, we're working with the agencies on the other hand. And I'll say this is one thing that the Trump administration has done very well is they've enabled all the federal agencies to do what we've been wanting to do for a long time. As I mentioned, I've been a federal regulator. I've been an economist for 4 administrations. We're always faced with that challenge of we want to clean the books out. We want to clean the underbrush, as we spoke about earlier, and we want to get it out, but we have a competing priority with all the new regulations that the administration that's sitting wants to push out. This administration has right-sized that, where you had at least a dozen agencies issue requests for information last year asking for what regulations need to go, which ones are pinching businesses, what's this underbrush. And we're finding regulations that are 10 years old, 40 years old, that are still impacting businesses, but we have the explicit mandate now to work with these agencies to reform that, and the businesses are excited. I was just in Boston last week, and I was talking to fishermen, and one fisherman said he counted and he is regulated by 17 different federal agencies, and a lot of them are overlapping. And you don't think often like, overlapping, big deal, what does it mean? But like Fish and Wildlife and NOAA, one agency calls a squid a shellfish and the other one doesn't. It sounds kind of silly and really niche, but what that means is if that fisherman hauls in a net, he has to have 2 different inspections done, one for one agency and one for the other, and that is time and that is money that he actually has to pay the overtime for the inspectors. So one thing that we're doing is we now have the license to go work with agencies and help them drive the regulatory change that they've been wanting to do for decades, and we can finally do it now.
I'm speaking with Chip Bishop. He's Deputy Chief Counsel for the Office of Advocacy at the Small Business Administration. Well, Chip, let's pull that thread a little bit farther because compliance and regulatory burden is a huge topic. If you're trying to rationalize regulations across 17 agencies, how does that happen?
Yeah, I would say that getting the agencies to coordinate has always been a challenge. But one thing that unites them is when we hear enough from our small businesses and we can present a clear case and we can get a lot of agencies to the table. So we have a regional outreach program. We've got staff across the country, and they're out there. And when they find an issue that a small business raises, we look at it and we say, hey, I wonder if this is other places in the country. And we start asking around and we start pulling these threads, and we're finding that these regulations have been impacting businesses across the country. And what we can do then is we gather a report. So our office is organized with a bunch of attorneys, economists, and a communications staff. And we take those issues in. We also establish a red tape hotline. So even if we don't reach the small businesses, they can call us. They can call our 800 number. They can email us at redtape@sba.gov, or they can go on our website and fill out a form. And that tells us, hey, I'm experiencing a problem. I'm getting pinched by some federal program. Can you help? And we take that into our intake process, and then we prepare all the background that's needed to share it with the agencies. And the agencies have been really grateful, and we take it a step further. Our office was set up to help agencies. So a lot of agencies haven't heard of our office. They might have known they had to do a 610 review, which is a retrospective review on their regs at least every 10 years. What they might not know is that our office is at the ready to step in and help them do these analyses, to take some of the weight off their shoulders. And our goal is when we have an engagement with an agency, it is to make the timeline faster than if they tried to go it on their own.
So does that red tape hotline primarily apply to the small entity clients, or can folks who are in the federal government who say, I really need some help on this deregulation effort also call you?
Yeah, I mean, our door is always open, so they can reach out to us directly. The red tape hotline specifically is for small entities facing regulatory burden, but our office, we're coming around the bend on 50 years. We've always been helpful and ready to help these federal clients.
That is a resource I bet most people don't know about.
They don't, and I'm happy to tell people about it.
Speaking of resources, let's talk about AI, because every conversation ultimately winds up there these days. We're hearing that AI is a game changer for small businesses. Not only is it helping them more quickly process the whole federal business space, but it's helping them select the right proposals to respond to. It's shaping even their protests if it gets to that point. What are you hearing, and how is AI playing out in your world?
No, you're absolutely right. And it's nice to talk about this because we just published in September a report, AI in Business, Small Firms Closing In. And we looked at this emerging AI technology, and small businesses have been loving it because if you're a small business, do you have the budget to hire a marketing professional and an office like administrative person and someone to do operations or do logo design? And suddenly, with paying a couple bucks a month, you can have professional products at your doorstep. So a lot of small businesses are using it, but there's still that gap because a small business, they got a lot of things on their mind. So, while their adoption has been growing and they've been catching up to large firms, they're still focused a lot on marketing and issues, not as much integration, but we're seeing that change. The ubiquity of the tools and the quality of them is expanding, and small businesses are really leveraged to use that to enhance the opportunities and the products that they offer.
How is that linking back to the deregulatory work that you mentioned up front?
I mean, I think the theme is pretty consistent, that AI has cut out a lot of transaction costs. And that's really the goal for the deregulatory push, is to cut out transaction costs, things that were one-size-fits-all rules that applied to small businesses that are at the margins. They're the ones driving change. I was down in Austin, Texas, and they're building a big Samsung facility, a $40 billion facility. But I think they said they're contracting 175 small businesses to do it, right? And they're in there. They're at the tip of the spear of innovation, but they're often held back. There are regulations that tell small businesses, like, you need to report who owns you. Well, a small business, you might be working on a loan from your grandmother. You might be having, a lien on your estate to get some cash. So when you're reporting these things, for a large business, it's pretty clear. But for small businesses, they have to run around, hire CPAs. A lot of the rules that come out of government come from this posture of seeing the big businesses, but they're ignorant of a lot of the smalls that are operating under the surface that represent almost 99% of most industries are, by a firm count, are small businesses.
Well, with the report that's out now and some of the metrics that are in there, as you look ahead to 2026, where's your next focus for improvement?
Yeah, 2025 was really, because we're in the regulatory world, which tends to lag, we were building infrastructure. So we collected over 400 ideas for regulations that need change from our small businesses, and we've been teeing those up to agencies, telling them directly these are things we'd like reform on. So now we've got placeholders. When new small businesses talk to us, they call us, they send into the red tape hotline, and they say, we've got this issue, let's drive it forward. And now the agencies are starting to churn out their notice of proposed rulemakings, and we're able to engage at that stage and say, hey, please don't ignore this voice. We've got a report that's ready-made for you.
That's exciting, and it sounds like it'll be a busy year.
A busy year full of a lot of opportunity, and I'm really excited for it.
I've been speaking with Chip Bishop. He's the Deputy Chief Counsel for the Office of Advocacy at the Small Business Administration. Thanks so much for joining me today.
It was my pleasure.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive on your schedule. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. The Trump administration wants to start privatizing more airport security screening operations. The White House's 2027 budget request would cut jobs at the Transportation Security Administration and shift much of that funding to private screening contractors. For more, Federal News Network's Justin Doubleday joins me now. Justin, thanks for being here.
Good to be here, Terry.
This is a popular topic these days. What's in the TSA budget request for privatization?
So TSA's fiscal 2027 budget justification documents details this privatization shift. The agency would cut roughly 8,400 positions from its budget out of 61,000 today. And that includes approximately 4,500 airport security screener positions. That would reduce TSA's budget for personnel costs by about $530 million. But TSA would redirect much of that funding, about $477 million, to something called the Screening Partnership Program, or the SPP. That's where TSA actually gives private companies contracts to do airport screening at select airports. Right now there's about 20 airports in the program today.
We've seen how the difference in performance at those airports played out over the DHS shutdown. How would TSA expand the program with that extra money?
So TSA, under this plan in the budget, would require all Category 3 and 4 airports to shift to using the Screening Partnership Program rather than relying on TSA airport screeners. Now, Category 3 and Category 4 airports, as defined by TSA, are the smallest commercial airports out of the 440 or so commercial airports across the country. And so this would be extremely small county airports, regional airports, really small places that don't have a lot of throughput initially. There are roughly at least 50 to 60 or so of those airports across the country right now. So that would increase the Screening Partnership Program to 80 airports on top of, at the very least, on top of the 20 that exist today. So they're kind of starting small. But again, the Office of Management and Budget document that initially announced this request said that this begins privatization of TSA. So there's something of a push within this administration to start shifting TSA toward more private operations for sure.
What's the argument of starting this new privatization effort at the smaller airports instead of the big ones like Atlanta?
That's certainly an effort to prove out a concept, I think. And this would not be a major change for most folks. shifting a major airport's screening operations where they have multiple gates and multiple entryways onto those gates and multiple, hundreds of TSA officers and all these different machines in different cases. That would be a big lift, and that could cause some disruption. Certainly the smaller airports would allow you to minimize disruptions to most people and start to prove this out. And there's been kind of the longstanding argument that private contractors could do this more efficiently than TSA. And then there's the recent argument you alluded to that this would insulate airports from shutdown effects because TSA screeners aren't paid during shutdowns typically, and then they start calling out, understandably, because they need to make money other ways, and then you start to see these impacts of shutdowns. The SPP Screening Partnership Program airports didn't have those impacts as we saw during the latest shutdown, and so that's been another kind of feather in the cap for arguments for privatizing TSA.
That seems like a pretty compelling argument to me, but there are folks who argue against it. What's their logic?
Well, TSA was created in the aftermath of 9/11 when the hijackers were able to get through private screening checkpoints onto planes with weapons. And, that's how it was done pre-9/11. TSA was created to replace those private security contractors at airports and to have a standardized, kind of more controlled, federalized way of doing this. And so, the arguments nowadays, you hear from certainly the union that represents TSA screening officers, the American Federation of Government Employees, alludes to how this would kind of put profit over security and safety potentially. And so that point of view is certainly still very strong. And I think, we have to go see how Congress takes this request. But I think that it will be interesting to see the number of Republicans who agree with the privatization push today, because I think over time we've seen Republicans really support the TSA workforce. A lot of them actually wanted to increase TSA pay several years ago when that finally happened, when they got the pay increase. That was widely supported by Republicans. And so it'll be interesting to see how many now, there's certainly some that exist today, but how many would come around to the idea of privatizing more TSA operations going forward.
Even if they did expand privatization, TSA still bears the responsibility for ensuring that the contractors are meeting all the proper protocols, right?
That's correct. That's how the Screening Partnership Program works today. Is TSA has oversight of the contractors. They contract with the contractors in the first place. It's not like airports go out and choose their own contractor. So it's still a TSA-run program. TSA would still exist in a lot of different privatization proposals that you see. They would just manage the private contractors, and that's certainly how the Screening Partnership Program works today.
So, Justin, what happens next with this proposal?
Well, as I mentioned, Congress now has to weigh in, as it does with all budget requests. They would have to approve this shift in funding to the Screening Partnership Program, this roughly $500 million away from TSA airport screening jobs to the Screening Partnership Program and private contractors. It'll be interesting to see how this plays out with the smaller airports, too, who would have to kind of manage this shift and what they tell their members of Congress in different areas. There's a lot of different politics at the national level and the local level that all kind of weighed into this issue.
That's Federal News Network's Justin Doubleday. Justin, thanks for bringing us this story. It seems like there might be a rare opportunity for bipartisan agreement here.
We will see. It'll be an interesting one to follow. You
can find Justin's story at federalnewsnetwork.com. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Sandiford. Our web editor is Stephanie Wright. Do you need to know more about how agencies are unifying services and scaling AI for the next era of government delivery? Join Federal News Network's DX Exchange Monday, April 13th at 1 o'clock. Register now at federalnewsnetwork.com. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.